Hello everyone and welcome to our video on Victorian economics for 1.8. With 1.9 coming upon us soon in around June, I wanted to kind of make an economics fundamentals video for Victoria 3 before they go ahead and change how trade works on us. So this video will be very applicable to 1.9. There might be some changes coming with companies, but a lot of this is going to be usable in your current games and your games in version 1.9. So if you've been having issues with getting your economy off the ground, maybe it's still at 1 GDPC, maybe you just can't get anything going, there's no demand, factories aren't working, hopefully this guide will help you resolve those issues. So we're going to go over a couple of different topics today. We're going to go over peasants, non-peasants, how those consumables work, market access, price impact in companies, production methods and qualifications, and then we're going to round it all off with how do you grow your economy? How do you grow that GDP? How do you make the line go up? So first off, peasants, wonderful people. Usually they will make up the majority of your workers at the start of the game. If we go over to our population screen and charts, in Russia, we can see they make up about 76% of the population. So they're really big. The problem is that these peasants are the worst class in the game. I would honestly say, stake my 3,200 hours on it, these guys are the worst. And the reason why, that we'll go into here, is because they don't demand goods that much. So if we go to this group, it's about 1.59 million people right now. We'll say about 1.6 million people. If we go over here to grain, we're going to notice something very interesting. First off, it's telling us they're consuming almost 30 grain for 1.6 million people per week. We see there's a consumption factor multiplied by 103 depending on how many of them are workers, how many of them are dependents, and the size of the group. But then notice this, plus 0.05 for peasants. Peasants and slaves that work on subsistence farms are the only pops that get this, and this is what makes them the worst pop group in the game. Because if we go find a different pop group, let's go, say, to this wheat farm, with 400,000, this is 400,000 people, it's about a fourth of the size, with slightly higher standard of living that we'll get into. They're consuming 154 grain. Their consumption factor is multiplied to 26, based on workforce independence with that +1. But if we go back to those peasants who are in the same state, who are only a 1 standard of living lower, their consumption factor is actually worse despite the fact they're 4 times as large with the same workforce ratio. So this is why peasants are the worst for your economy. They are economically inactive. The only good thing about peasants is that they don't starve to death while working on subsistence farms. So they at least stay above minimum expected standard of living. And standard of living is very important to pop consumption as well. The higher the standard of living a pop has, basically it's base wealth, modifiers don't affect their consumption. The higher their standard of living, the more goods they demand, and at certain thresholds, they will demand more and more luxurious goods. As an example I can give you right now, if we mouse over their net income here, and then go to their needs, we can see that at standard of living 9, they're demanding basic food, intoxicants, crude items. If you want more information on those, you can mouse over any of them, and these handy tooltips are going to tell you more. What goods are considered this? What goods satisfy this need? You can even go over to their consumption page to get a bigger breakdown if you want. Now, if we go to a much richer pop, say our capital... Oh, these capitalists are poor. Hang on. Here we are. If we go to our aristocrats who are prosperous, we see one of their biggest demands is actually tea right now. It's very expensive. And if we go over to their needs, we can see they have a lot more demands. They start demanding luxury drinks at level 15. They start demanding standard clothing at level 10. Luxury goods at 15. Services at 10. They start demanding luxury foods at 20. Grain no longer fully sates their consumption needs. So standard of living basically decides how many goods are the pops going to demand, what types of goods are they going to demand, are they meeting that minimum expected standard of living, which if they're below this, for a quick keynote, people will radicalize over time. Radicals are usually not good unless you're trying to force change through civil war. Standard of living will also affect the birth rate and mortality rate of pop groups. Generally speaking, your standard of living growing up from, say, 9 towards 20, will see your pop growth increase over time. So as this average number gets larger, especially for your lower strata, who will usually make up most of your pops for much of the game, as that gets higher, people grow faster. Until around standard of living 20, when it really starts to fall off because the birth rate and mortality numbers start to get a lot closer together. If we mouse over to Britain really quick and grab some of their richer capitalists, we can see they have a very low birth rate and a very low mortality rate because of how rich they are. So that's a side note to note for that game mention. Because population does also affect how big can your economy get, how much are you demanding. So the keynotes for this is that peasants are the absolute worst pop group you can have in the game because they are economically inactive, they barely demand goods. So a first key step to growing your economy, you want this number, the percentage number of your workforce being peasants, and your population by extension, you want to get this to be as low as possible. The lower it is, the more goods you're going to have being demanded from your pops. One final way to show this off, if we mouse over here to the British East India Company, where it's got the slaves as well. If we go over to arable land and check the slaves here, we will see slaves working on subsistence farms demand the same amount that peasants do. But if they're working at opium plantations or anything else that isn't subsistence farms, they will demand the same amount as regular workers. And a very quick thing to double check, because the US does start with homesteading, does this affect farmers as well? The answer is no. Farmers working on subsistence farms will actually demand the normal amount of goods. It only affects peasants and slaves. So that's a little keynote to note there. As for the workforce and dependent ratios, because we do need to mention this does have a big effect. Dependents will demand half the goods that a worker would demand. That's why when you mouse over here, you see the multipliers based on the workforce and dependents. A higher workforce ratio will increase this multiplier for a pop group. So the higher your workforce ratio, the more goods your people are demanding. But that means you have more people you also need to employ. So if you can keep up with the employment, it's usually better to increase your workforce ratio. But say you're playing a nation like Qing, which has several 100 million people already, you probably want to focus on getting rid of the peasants you have first, because they're demanding 5% of the goods that a regular pop normally would. So they're actually worse than dependents. And with that said, we are now going to talk about market access price impact, and by extension companies. Market access price impact is known as MAPI in the community for short, and we'll refer to it as such. MAPI decides how much of a good is decided by your national market. Now, the base starting level is 75. But Russia has a law called traditionalism that we'll get into really quick. So first off, before I deviate, because I almost did there, as we can see here in Kiev, 65% of the price of clothes in this state is decided by the market price. Right now it's at 46.6%. Or not percent, that's ducats. And then 35% is decided by the production and consumption of those goods. Since Kiev is making more clothes than it consumes right now, it's pricing at plus 32% for clothes rather than plus 55%. Why does this matter? Well, not only does it affect the price of the goods for pops who are buying them, if we go to these laborers, they're paying that local price. Over here at the consumption, it will tell you the full market price, but they're actually paying minus 14% compared to the Russian market price right now for clothes. But it also matters for your businesses, because here's a problem. This textile mill is selling these clothes below market price. But not only that, it is buying fabric at minus 3% base price despite it being minus 30% in the market. So it's paying more for goods that it needs to make items, and then it's selling those items below the market price because our market access price impact is sitting at 60% at a base level. There are several ways to increase this. First off, you might notice that Kiev has the Dnieper River. Certain river modifiers will give a 5% increase than the market access price impact. That is very noteworthy. These are usually better areas to build in somewhat early on, but as a nation like Russia, you will usually be spreading your buildings out early on until you fix that. We're going to quickly go over to traditionalism here, one of the worst laws in the game, to note a few things. It does a lot of negatives, but what we're going to go over for now is market access price impact. It is causing a horrific minus 15% to MAPI. So it is making all of our systems less efficient. It is making businesses pay more for goods that it needs and sell its goods at a lower price. That means it doesn't have as much money to give owners, like capitalists. It doesn't have as much money to pay its workers. So that's just going to make it a lot harder for it to operate. Your people have less money, they have less money to spend. So this is a law you want to get rid of as soon as possible. Change it to agrarianism. I would even hesitantly argue industry banned is better because it gets rid of that MAPI negative, but I would argue early game, go for agrarianism. It'll work. Or interventionism, just get off traditionalism. It will hurt you. So with that mentioned, there are a few technologies you can use in the society tree to improve your market access price impact as well. The stock exchange will give a 10% increase. It's a very early tier 1 technology. Pretty much anyone can get this relatively quickly. It is definitely a technology you should look for early on. It's going to help your economy quite a bit. Then, much later on, Zeppelins will give you a plus 5%. It's the only reason to research Zeppelins, but I would highly recommend going for them at some point. And then macroeconomics, that gives you a company slot and another 5%. If you get all the technologies possible, market access price impact can reach 95%, presuming you don't have traditionalism and you have all 3 of the technologies. Which also means states that have that plus 5% river modifier in the late game can reach 100% market access price impact, meaning they're fully decided by the price in the market and they do not care about local consumption and production. That's how the game used to work until MAPI was introduced. We are now going to quickly go over companies. Right now, Russia can't use any companies at the start because we have no slots. You have society research like macroeconomics that will give you one, and the laissez-faire economic law will also give you a slot. Since we don't have any, we're going to go over to Britain really quick and just take a peek at one of their companies. In this case, they have the Great Western Railway, which affects... Oh, my dog decided to start the game. Don't do that, doggo. It affects the railways, any railways it owns. This is the key thing to note, actually. If we go to France, they should have a company as well, if I can figure out where they've placed it. Oh no, France, where's your company? Where did it start? Here it is. So in this case, the company in Alsace-Lorraine owns 5 of the textile mills. It's not doing well right now. But as we can see here, by owning all those textile mills, it's giving the full bonus of its company throughput. Companies will provide a throughput bonus to any buildings they own that they specialize in. Previous iterations, the companies just provided a flat bonus, but nowadays they need to own the building to provide that bonus. And how much of the throughput bonus they'll provide is dependent on several factors. There is a base value of 25, but your prestige ranking will matter. There are other modifiers that can increase this, and then how much of the building is owned by that company. If we head back over to the East India Company, we can see a few things here. The East India Company itself, a company, owns 5 of these 25 buildings, about 20%. That is causing them to only give about 20% of the throughput bonus. So the one reason to get companies is to get that throughput bonus increase. But another reason is to get it specifically for various bonuses. Companies will provide a prosperity bonus if the productivity of those buildings reaches a certain point. In this case, it needs to be about 20% higher than the global average productivity of all buildings in the world, or it needs to reach, let's see, there was another one. It was about 1.25 average productivity and something else I can't remember. So we're doing great. But anyway, as long as your buildings are highly productive, the companies will always reach their prosperity bonus. And right here below, it will list that prosperity bonus. For example, the generic food company that anyone can get will give you a 5% increase to your birth rate, giving you more pops if that's what you really want. Companies have various establishment requirements. Usually, you just need a certain number of levels of that building in a state, and then you need to be able to give that building to a company. So in this case, we would need 5 levels of a food industry in a state, and then we would need to own at least 5 of those levels, in this case all of them, in order to give it to the company. Companies can also be dismantled after being established, but it takes about 5 years for that to be done. So you won't be able to dismantle a company until 5 years after establishing it. And there are various good bonuses you can get in here. Certain ones have various requirements. For example, the United Construction Conglomerate, you need the Principal Construction 3 for power blocks. We're not going to go over that, but that's something to note. Some companies need to be built in specific states, so you have to own a specific state and build stuff there in order to actually use it. Baku, for example, has a special oil company for Russia, which I believe, if we were to organize the names here it is, the Branoval. So in this case, you would need to own Baku and have 5 oil rigs there, along with some other requirements. But essentially, you have specialized companies that come from certain states that give different prosperity bonuses. In this case, it also gives a 5% railway building throughput in Baku on top of the 10% migration attraction that the generic oil company gives. Generic is something anyone can get, specialized requires certain states. If you do play your cards right, it is possible to get companies to have a pseudo-monopoly on various buildings, to the point where you might have an iron company that owns 70% of your iron mines and is providing throughput bonuses to all of them. Companies usually get a weighted bonus to buildings, both purchasing them and building them. They're more likely to do it, but you'll notice it more later on in the game when your investment pool has more money to throw around. One more thing we need to go over really quick, though, is locally produced goods. There are 3 goods in the game that cannot be sold on the market and only have local prices. That is services, transportation, and electricity. The third one, electricity, you won't have right off the bat in the game, but all 3 of these can only be produced in the state they're made in. They can only be produced there, they can only be consumed there. So, a power plant in Kiev can't power stuff in Moscow, for example. And services in Moscow can't supply anything needed in Perm, vice versa, so on and so forth, same with transportation. I'm sorry, but 500 railways in Alaska will not be satisfying all your transportation needs, no matter how funny it is. And so that is something to keep in mind with those 3 goods, is that you will need to make them in their local areas. But usually those are produced by urban centers that are built automatically as time goes on, as you're building things up. And electricity is a little more tricky, you may need to subsidize it a bit. With all that mentioned, we are going over production methods and qualifications now. Production methods are a bit simple to understand. They are the methods in which a building produces things and runs. For the case of businesses like a textile mill, we have a few different slots to go over. First off, we have your primary production method. So this is the primary good the building usually makes without any other adjustments. It's usually, in most cases, a basic good, but depending on the building, it could be certain luxurious goods, such as the synthetic plant makes dye initially, as an example. In this case, the production method for the textile mill decides what goods it uses as an input, what goods it makes as an output. And in this case, right now at hand-sewn clothes, it uses fabric to make clothes. It's at a very bad ratio for fabric to clothing too. As you can see, 40 fabric to 45 clothes. It also tells us how many people it hires, and this is all per level. This is all it will produce per level, not taking into account throughput, which we'll go over shortly. Actually, we already went over it, didn't we? No, we didn't. We'll go over that soon, I promise. Anyway, higher level production methods require better technologies, usually found in the production tree for most of them, but some are in your military and society text respectively for certain buildings such as your military and government. As you're going up in each levels, the system will try to give you a predicted idea of the change in balance, but this is not always accurate, so I would take it with a grain of salt. But you do have a lot of the base information here that you can then use yourself with a little bit of math. So as you can see, Dye Workshops introduces 5 dye to make more clothes and makes some of the laborers into machinists. So it changes who is being employed here, and something to keep in mind is that various professions are paid more at a base level. To show you that really quickly here, as we can see, these 300 shopkeepers are being paid at wage factor of ×3 because they're shopkeepers. Laborers, however, they're just being paid a flat wage. So that is something else to keep in mind. But this is your primary production method for clothing. Next, we have purple production methods, which are usually an alternative method of production. They will usually reduce the primary production method in exchange for making a different good. Sometimes this can be a different resource, like making liquor at a rye farm. Or in the case of a textile mill, you're making luxury clothes at a cost of not making some of those regular clothes. As you can see here, you would be using less fabric, you'd be using more silk, you'd be making luxury clothes and making less regular clothes. And right now, luxury clothes are extremely cheap because the game only just started. Things haven't really adjusted yet. But this is a good way to see, hey, this is what we'd be producing as an alternative method. And if you're ever wondering how to unlock a different method, the game will always tell you what you need to invent for that. So you can mouse over it here, and then click on this neat little button to be brought straight to your technology tree, where you'll have to find it anyway. Don't worry, you'll find it pretty well. They're usually in the production tree for most of them. And then you have your green production methods. These are automation production methods. The primary goal of these is to add an input, so 5 tools, for example, to remove workers. This is not something you will normally use in the early game. You will usually use this when your workforce numbers are starting to reach a point where you don't really have unemployed and you don't really have peasants. You might use this in a couple states that don't have a lot of people right away. But generally, this is kind of a mid to late game technology, depending on who you're playing as. Some nations do use it sooner just because they don't have a lot of people at the start. But it will remove workforce, which can then ideally be just given higher job levels as you're just building up the buildings more and more as you go. There is another production method that we need to go over, I believe. If I could just find a building that has one. We'll just add something here really quick. Actually, no, there used to be a blue production method for ownership, but ownership was changed to where it is now here in financial districts with building ownership levels. These basically decide who owns what, who is getting what, who is owning this stuff. In this case, for financial districts, you have privately owned and publicly traded. This is kind of deciding who is working here as well. As you can see, if we were to change it over to publicly traded, you get more clerks, more bureaucrats, less shopkeepers. That has a bit of an effect on the social fabric of your society. So it is always worth thinking about changing this if you want to. Who do you want to have power? The blue production methods help you decide that a lot. As for your military, there are the military production methods, which is usually just your training methods. And you'll generally just want to be increasing these because it helps you train more manpower per week. Not anything too serious. Your government administration has some blue production methods as well. Who do you want to be employing? Do you want the clergy in your government? Or maybe you just want more bureaucrats? It affects who's getting political power from who exists. And these also have primary production methods with their own inputs and outputs. It's a lot to take in, but don't worry. There are lots of tooltips for you to read. They give you a pretty good idea of what's going to change usually. And it is always worth just kind of taking the time, reading it over, looking at different things, seeing what it does, reading over everything. So that is kind of the general gist of production methods. They decide what's being produced, who owns what. You've got a lot of different methods to go over at a lot of different buildings. And it's usually but not always, the higher production methods are better. There can be instances where maybe it's actually not better to go for them. For example, the arcades here will actually add more jobs, which can cause urban centers in the late game to struggle with employment because now they've got more workers who are also of higher pay requirement. But usually, increasing your production method will be good more often than not, and it will help improve your economy as it's producing more goods and producing more luxurious goods that have more value. And with that, we're now going to go over a bit about throughput that we mentioned a few times before. This modifier decides how much the business is producing extra relative to its level. So at 24% throughput in the logging camp, that means it is using 24% more inputs, so 24% more tools, but it's producing 24% more wood and hardwood at the same level without employing more people. This is especially useful on limited resource deposits rather than urban buildings because it lets you extract more of those resources from the same level. But this can be good for your urban buildings too because it allows them to produce more goods at the exact same level with the exact same employment, and usually almost always leads to a higher weekly balance, allowing them to pay a higher wage. Throughput is affected by a couple modifiers. The economy of scale, that is how big your buildings are. The maximum level for this is plus 50, but it does start at a base value of 20. A couple production techs will increase this over time. It also matters whether or not the government owns levels. The government owning levels in various businesses can cause some of them to produce less. In fact, let me buy a couple of these levels right now just to give you an idea. We'll nationalize 5 of them, and then we'll show you. As you can see, the economy of scale is now dropping a bit. The economy of scale bonuses are dropped by up to minus 50% if it is completely owned by the government, and partially scales down all the way to 0 the less percentage of it that you own. But the government will get some of the dividends from this straight into its own coffers. Usually this is not very efficient at the start, especially if you're running deficits and bureaucracy, so we're not going to go into it. But generally speaking, higher throughput is better. It also means we need to very quickly cover credit, because this is very important. Going into deficit spending is not bad in Victoria 3. It only gets bad when you can no longer pay and you max out your credit. If your credit is completely maxed out, every single building in your country will start to suffer a continually worsening throughput modifier, up to, I believe, minus 50%. And this affects everything, including government administration buildings that do tax collection. So while going into deficit and borrowing money is fine, don't reach the point where you hit your credit limit, because otherwise it's a downward spiral and you may be forced to declare bankruptcy. So if you're going to borrow money, make sure you have the ability to pay it back later. Deficit spending is good, defaulting is bad. And now we just need to cover qualifications for this section. Qualifications is something fairly simple. It is basically, can this person do this job? Are they qualified for it? You can find this by mousing over the workforce, but there's also the job seekers area on the state tab that we'll go over. And if you mouse over qualifications right here in the building section, you can see how many qualifications exist that are potentially employable, and how many are being gained or lost per month. Qualifications are decided primarily on two factors. How much money does the POP have, and what is their literacy level? And this is very important. There are several critical thresholds that decide when someone can start gaining higher level qualifications. Certain qualifications, like being a slave, working in the army, being a peasant, a laborer, are always possible. People need almost nothing to get that. But others require something a bit more. For example, being a peasant will help them increase their farmer qualification. Unfortunately, this is where we come to another terrible law, serfdom. Serfdom will cause a massive reduction to the qualification gain for anyone who is a peasant. So not only are they economically inactive, they suck at generating qualifications while serfdom is law. Once serfdom is no longer a law, this negative goes away, but as you can see, it's cutting out almost all of their potential qualification gain per month for being a farmer. And this can prevent them from gaining various qualifications entirely. For example, they have an inefficient literacy, so we can't show it here, but things like becoming a capitalist for a peasant is basically impossible, even if they have the money and the literacy, if they're still a serf under serfdom. So with that mentioned, let us find a more qualified personnel. In this case, we'll go to these laborers who are at standard of living 14 with literacy of 21. This is actually very useful for us here, because as we'll see, they're gaining a lot of good qualifications over time. They're even gaining capitalist qualifications, which requires a base wealth of 10 and a base literacy of 20 to start gaining it all, which means, in fact, most qualifications cannot be gained unless a POP has at least 20% literacy. 20% literacy is that critical threshold that you need to start generating most qualifications. Wealth 10 is another critical threshold for most qualifications as well to start gaining any of them at all. But the aristocrats require an even higher level of wealth. And so that means you're roughly aiming for a standard of living of 10 and a literacy rate of 20 as two critical thresholds to reach to start generating a lot of qualifications per month over time. Otherwise, a lot of your qualifications are generated very slowly, and if most of your people are peasants under serfdom, they're going to gain almost no qualifications at all. And if you lack qualifications, businesses can't employ. Sure, you might have 50 million laborers who are ready to work, but if you don't have those 2,000 shopkeepers to help run this logging camp, it's not going to fully hire. If you've only got 500 shopkeepers, it's going to hire maybe 4,000 to 5,000 laborers and then stall out, waiting to hire more shopkeepers to keep it balanced. So qualifications are essential to growing your economy. Without qualifications, you're not really going to get that far unless you're just building only farms. And now with all of that gathered together, we're going to kind of give you ideas of the early economic loop for GDP growth and kind of how do you grow your economy with all this information. So the early economic loop, you might hear a lot of players talk about the early construction loop, the early economic loop, however they talk about it. What we're talking about here, as I set this up, is that construction loop I just mentioned. It is building construction sectors that you can afford to pay for. Maybe that's by raising taxes or lowering the input costs. So maybe we're adding some taxes here. We've raised taxes as well, and now we're building all of these construction sectors. We're building what we think we'll be able to afford even if we go into a deficit. We'd let those build up for a while as we play. And then what we're going to look for next is what does it cost us to build things? What are we using to build things? In this case, I switched over to the iron frame production method. This means we're using iron, fabric, wood, and tools to build our buildings. That is what's giving us our construction points. So once you've built those construction sectors that you can reasonably afford or borrow for, your next goal is to focus on the main items that are increasing that construction cost. What is being driven up in expenditure? What is costing you the most to build? In this case with iron frame, it will usually be iron and tools, because by switching over to this, we're actually using less fabric and less wood while getting more construction points. So your next goal after building all of these construction sectors, as Russia for example, you'd want to start looking in states like where can I build iron mines here, maybe some iron mines there, a few in Tula where I have the infrastructure. And then of course, since those also need tools, you'd be thinking about, well, maybe I'm going to want to build a couple tooling workshops in Kursk. It can afford it. The area already has a demand for tools. We're building some construction sectors there that will use tools, and we're kind of just spreading that out. And a side note, early game, you might want to also subsidize your iron mines in areas like Russia early on, because this will kind of raise the wage a bit with you paying for it and will incentivize the few qualified people you have to work there. Because your goal right now is to get construction built, build iron mines, build tool workshops, and then probably do it again. You loop back around. You build more construction sectors that you can now afford because it got cheaper to build construction. And then you're building more iron mines, you're building more tool workshops, you're spreading it out while doing technology to, say, for example, get stock exchange to improve your market access price impact, making it easier to keep those mines more affordable, making iron cheaper. And that's kind of the early construction loop you're doing, because now you're also employing peasants into actual jobs that aren't them being peasants. You're getting that economic activity going while trying to pass laws such as ending peasant levies or ending serfdom, getting off traditionalism. And all of that together helps to start generate that economic loop. And at some point you might branch off, you might start building universities to get innovation so you can do research faster till you hit your cap. Maybe you build past that for some extra tech spread. Maybe you go over here, you start building, say, 30 rye farms, because that will force peasants to become laborers and farmers. That will increase the economic activity, because subsistence farms are built from unused arable land. But now we're going to start using some of that arable land. And, maybe you start making all of your liquor from your rye farms, and you tell your food industries, hey, we're just going to focus on making groceries. That way, all of our liquor demand starts being satisfied by these rye farms. So even if things get really cheap for grain here, we also have that liquor we're producing at a cost of not producing some of that grain. That way, we're forcing these peasants to become more economically active, who will usually, at low standard of living, they'll buy liquor, they'll buy grain. It kind of feeds itself into a cycle. Growing that GDP, getting more tax revenue, building up more construction. It's that early economic loop. We're trying to get more construction points so we can employ more people at once to get that peasant number down to increase our economic activity. To give you an example of a state that is probably a lot lower when it comes to the number of peasants, if we switch over to Britain here, Britain is a bit different. They only have 48.7% of their population as peasants. And if we see their GDP per capita is a lot closer to 1 than Russia, who's sitting about I believe, 0.46 or so? 0.47. That's because they have less peasants. They still have a lot of peasants, don't get me wrong, but more of their workers are gainfully employed or unemployed than being peasants. And that is a good side note, really. Because if we can find one of their unemployed workers here, They're destitute, so they're kind of dying, they're starving. But if we go down here, they're still demanding the same amount as an employed laborer does at the same standard of living level, even though they're unemployed and starving. So, quick side note, Social Security can come in hand here in the mid to late game, but early game I wouldn't worry about it. So with that in mind, that is kind of that early economic loop, that early construction loop. Get more construction, make more resources for construction, get more construction, employ more people, find areas where you can employ a bunch of those peasants at once to get more demand going so you can build other buildings, keep them profitable, and you kind of just go back and forth in this loop as you're building things up, you're getting everything off the ground, and you're industrializing. That is something I would focus heavily on learning for your early game. Certain nations, as we showed, like Great Britain, are further ahead on this loop already, and your situation may vary or be different. Certain nations like Belgium are smaller in their economy at the start, so the amount of construction they can afford isn't going to be the same as the size that Russia can afford, or Britain, or Prussia, or the United States. So it's always good to build relative to the amount that you can afford, even if that means borrowing a little, as long as you can pay it back to avoid bankruptcy. And that's kind of some of the core early fundamentals of Victorian 3 economics. Getting rid of your peasants, building up your standard of living in order to get more demand, building up your workforce ratio so the same population size demands more goods, building up that market access price impact to make things more easily affordable, more interconnected, getting good companies with bonuses that you want, making sure your production methods are improving with stuff you can afford, raising that throughput level in order to produce more goods from the same building from the exact same level. And kind of just deciding what production methods do you want? What goods do you want to create? Is it better to make luxury goods now in the hopes that your pops buy more, or do you want to focus on just lowering the base clothing price? Getting your literacy rate on average to 20% or higher to generate qualifications, getting rid of peasants or getting them off serfdom so they get qualifications for work. All of that stuff is extremely important. You need to build all of that up in order to start raising that GDPC to 4, 5, 6, etc., getting that economy up, getting that standard of living to higher levels. As long as you learn that core economic loop and learn these key fundamentals, I guarantee your economies will improve. You will have trial and error, you will have times when things stop working and you've got to figure it out, but it's okay. Victoria 3 is a learning experience. It has a lot of interconnected parts. A sudden spike in tool prices could send iron mines firing people. Now your iron's getting more expensive because less people are working in the iron mines. You've just got to nail down where's the problem and then fix the problem. You can specialize as well as you want, and the upcoming 1.9 update that's changing trade may allow specialized economics, which can be very fun. So with all of that said, I hope this taught you something that made it a bit easier to understand why certain things aren't working, where you need to maybe improve on to help improve your economics. And if you have any additional questions after watching this video, feel free to ask them in the comments below. I will do my best to answer them. And if I don't have the answers, I'll ask someone else. You can also look at the Victoria 3 Wikipedia for more information as well. It's decently well documented and will give you a good deal of useful information for economics. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped you understand the game more. Hope it helps just answer questions. And I will see you next time.